As a longtime resident of New York City and having grown up here, I'm a believer that what we can all do in our local communities, and whether it's where you grew up or where you live now, it's important to contribute back to where you live and what you can do to help others. The goal of this property is to get people off the streets, to give them shelter, to give them safe, dignified housing. Yes, we believe housing first, but we also believe that it's housing with services. To be able to replicate this, we really need to see other agencies, other housing agencies around the country with the support from the local governments they operate in to provide the long-term subsidy contracts. That really is the key. I'm Scott Alter, and I'm the co-founder and managing partner of Standard Communities, which is an affordable housing developer. Founded in 2008, we own about 130 properties across about 18,000 apartment units in about 18 states, including Washington, D.C. So we have 6 offices across the country. We're in Los Angeles, Orange County, Chicago, Washington, D.C., New York City, and Charleston, South Carolina. And we house over 50,000 residents across all of our properties. Standard is focused on the preservation, acquisition, and long-term sustainability of affordable housing. We believe that housing is a pathway to human prosperity, so we do everything that we can to provide dignified, safe, clean, affordable housing. We focus really on capital A affordable, which is deed-restricted housing, and that really can range anywhere from homeless shelters to 60% of AMI, where we're using the low-income housing tax credit program, to 80 to 120% of AMI, which is sort of that missing middle.
Great. Well, now I'd like to zoom in on the interim housing project we're focusing on today, located in Manhattan, New York City, in the Hell's Kitchen neighborhood at 440 West 41st Street. And to help set the stage, just talk a little more about the location, prior uses of the project, where you saw the opportunity, and how many families are served, and how big is the project?
It's 109 units. It's a combination of studios and 1-bedrooms. Each one has its own bathroom. It's a family shelter, and residents can stay here upwards of 12 months. This property has been set up to have a daycare center. It's got 3 floors of social services space for offices and staff to be helping the residents of the property. It's in a unique location. It's right off the Lincoln Tunnels. It's 2 blocks from Times Square. It is in a very walkable location. If you were a half a block in any direction, you're just right where all the subways are. And you're also not far from Penn Station, which takes you out to New Jersey, Long Island, by train. This property was many different uses. It's been a hotel, it's been a corporate housing, furnished rental type property, and really has lost its identity over time. And when I first looked at buying it, there were all sorts of condo developers looking to buy it, high-end luxury apartment users, and I just knew this was a perfect property for some form of affordable housing. And as we entered into the pandemic, started to see that the homeless populations just continue to increase. And importantly, with homelessness comes a need for social services, daycare centers, and storage, which is super important. This building was able to provide all of that. And so in talking to the city over the last 4 years, a year after I had first heard about this project, we started to realize that it just made so much sense as a temporary homeless shelter. And particularly in New York, is children are not allowed in a lot of shelters. And so then what ends up happening is that it becomes a men's shelter. And because if there's children, they usually end up with the mom.
Yeah, so it's providing a much needed transitional housing opportunity for a very underserved segment within the unhoused population.
It's been a great success so far in the few months it's been open.
Yeah, so walk us through the timeline over the past 5 years when you first saw the property to a purchase and negotiation with the city, and the renovation, and now the opening of this project. And talk a little more about the partnerships and collaborations you had to build along the way.
5 years ago is when it was quietly marketed. It had been foreclosed on by the lender. A lender was saying, we want to be able to exit this property. And it was often furnished rentals. And we just saw that there was an opportunity to work with the city. And the city desperately needs the housing. We were able to work with the seller and find a way to buy it. And while we were in contract, we went to the city and said, we see this as an opportunity to provide a desperately needed housing for the underhoused of New York City. It's only 2 blocks from Times Square, 1 block from the Port Authority, and providing that kind of access to public transportation is extremely valuable. It took over a year from the time we started talking to them until we were able to negotiate a contract that made sense for everyone involved. The city was very supportive, and that's why and how we created a public-private partnership with them. So we bought the property. Camper Property Group is our partner on this project, and they helped us put together the package with the city and the Department of Homeless Services, and they helped us to put all the renovation together. So they were our co-GP on this property. We worked very closely with a nonprofit called WestHab, and WestHab worked with the city alongside us to create a social services program whereby WestHab is also the property manager, and the city is providing all of the subsidy for both the WestHab and for us to be able to run the shelter. We were trying to figure out how we could work with the city. We spoke to multiple different housing agencies within the city and trying to see whether this would be permanent supportive housing, whether it would be a LIHTC property, project-based voucher program, and what was the most important need for the city at that moment in this location, because it is so location-specific in New York City. Spring of 2020, just as COVID was hitting, DHS, the Department of Homeless Services in New York City, was very much committed at that point to saying, we want to do this property as a temporary housing facility for the underhoused. We spent about a year working with them and setting up the documents, working with our nonprofit to set up the right programming and have the right spaces for social services that are needed in this property. We closed in 2021 and spent just over a year in renovating and fixing up the common areas, interiors of the units where we needed to. We added 7 units that were previously not there. There was a floor of common area amenities that just wasn't being used. So we took a whole floor that was just common area facilities and converted it to residential, and then add a floor that had previously been DJ studio, so an actual audio AV studio that we were able to convert to common area. So we never lost any common area space because we just moved the common area space that was on the second floor that became residential. We moved that down to the basement. When you walk in on the first floor, it's the daycare center. It's a mail room, security room, 1 level down, various social service offices, storage, staffing. And then there's even a level down, which is a sub cellar that's additional used for not only mechanicals of the building, but also for storage and an additional office space. It really is 3 true floors of common area. When you go to the second floor through the 13th floor, is 109 units of residential, averaging anywhere from 600 square feet to as little as 300 square feet. In the ones that are 600 square feet, there is the ability to have multiple rooms. This property had been chopped up in various ways over its varying uses that it had in its life.
Now that we've talked about the timeline, let's talk about the budget and the capital sources that you used to buy and renovate the property. How did you sort of put the economics together on here?
Yeah, so we spent in the low $40 million in terms of buying it and the cost to put it all together. And then for renovation, we spent just over $9 million doing the systems upgrades, adding and upgrading units, storage, and all that common area amenity space. We were in the low $40 million. We spent $9 million between other costs like financing costs and just additional friction and soft costs. We probably are all in for just in the mid $50 million range. So it's just over $500,000 a unit. And really, when you look in the area, condo units are selling for $2 million a unit. You know, they're selling for $3,000 a foot. This property fully renovated is at $750, $800 a foot. It's just really much cheaper because of its particular location. I think ultimately, in order to create a successful public-private partnership, we need to provide services that the city agency needs. We also need to be able to earn some kind of return for the private investors that are making the long-term investments.
Because you're using private capital and you have to provide that private capital some return, like what is that kind of bandwidth of return, and sort of how does that, I guess, relate to sort of just in general, like private investor appetite for funding this type of product?
Before we closed on the acquisition, we had a commitment from the city to provide the funding to West Hab to provide the housing and the services. We actually saw some substantial demand for institutional capital to invest in this type of project. The returns, while I think on an opportunistic level would be in the high teens, if not 20% IRRs, with some sort of ongoing cash yield. In this situation, we were able to go to impact preservation investors who really believed in the long-term mission that the city was trying to provide to the underhoused and really what Standard believes. And we were able to do it at mid-teens type IRRs with high single-digit cash-on-cash yields once the property was fully stabilized. And we saw a lot of demand for that.
So it sounds like there's a lot of investment capital out there willing to help the city achieve long-term housing stability. But yeah, you kind of have to meet where the market is. Kind of banking, I guess, on the financial wherewithal of the city being able to provide that funding each year. So on the capital stacks, you had the equity that you raised, and then what type of debt or loan did you have on the property?
This was a balance sheet loan. We had a lot of lender demand on the debt side. So we worked with one of the largest lenders in the country focused on preservation of housing and the creation of housing and specifically community investing. There's definitely demand from multiple banks because of the CRA benefits that they do get.
And on the operational subsidy side, the payments and everything are coming from the Department of Homeless Services?
Correct. And, it's primarily funded by the city, but there are additionally federal subsidies that the city gets providing this housing. And so then they just pass that along to us. So all the subsidies funnel to the Department of Homeless Services, whether it's from the city, the state, the federal government, or even private capital, private charitable sources. All that funnels through the Department of Homeless Services, whereby they have a budget and then they fund that to West Hab.
So with the equity raised and the debt in place, how were those business terms in achieving that return to your investors achieved? Like, how were they developed?
For us, in order to spend the money that needed to be spent to not only buy the property, but then renovate the property to a place where it had all of those common area facilities and to upgrade the units to a place where they were fully livable, we had a certain costs that we had to spend. And then when we worked with the city, we said, okay, what are rents in the general location for a similar type property, and what rent would you pay, and what are you going to have to spend on services? And the city had a plan. We went to them and said, this is what it's going to cost. And they said, that makes sense for us. And so it really is a situation where they're not paying it like tenant-based vouchers. They are paying a certain monthly amount to West Hab, the nonprofit operator of the services and of the property. West Hab covers all their costs for running the property and then also pays rent to us for having spent all the money that we did to operate it.
What is the term of the contract with the city? How many years?
It's a 9-year contract with the city, and really what's happened historically is that those contracts have just gotten continually renewed, and there's really no situations where the city won't renew the contract, but it is set up right now as a long-term contract, and I think that's really helpful. That 9 years is really important.
Yeah, and how scalable do you think this public-private partnership is, where the private market provides the upfront capital and the public sector provides the ongoing operational subsidy?
It is a program that could be replicated. It is not about the upfront cost, and I think this is where we've seen other cities want to provide this type of housing, and they have money that's set aside for upfront capital to be able to do it. And I think that's really the focus where I see an opportunity is for cities to say, we don't need to provide the capital to the private sector up front. We need to provide that long-term rental subsidy, that long-term social services subsidy to operate properties. And if we provide those long-term contracts, then there are private investors who will set up public-private partnerships like Standard did with West Hab and with Department of Homeless Services in New York City. And as cities realize and run the numbers and the data on what it takes to not have the underhoused housed and the underhoused be on the streets, that costs way more than what it's going to cost and what it does cost right now for the Department of Homeless Services in New York to let West Hab and Standard Communities operate this property. New York State is a right to shelter state, and so the state is required to provide housing to anyone who asks for it. The cost of that has gone up dramatically too as housing costs have risen. A lot of the housing options locations are just not as safe, clean, and providing the level of services that this property does.
To be able to replicate this across other cities, what are the pieces that need to be in place?
To be able to replicate this, we really need to see other agencies, other housing agencies around the country, with the support from the local governments that they operate in, to provide the long-term subsidy contracts. That really is the key. And I think the biggest issues we've just ran into were COVID, number one, and making sure the city was comfortable with a long-term contract in this particular location, which they were very excited about.
So now that we've covered how this project's come together, let's just take a deeper dive into how the property works. As a transitional shelter, residents here have up to a year to stay. And then what happens along the process of these residents finding long-term housing stability?
So, the goal of this property is to get people off the streets, to give them shelter, to give them safe, dignified housing. And we give them up to 12 months. And West Hab provides the services, both daycare so that they can find jobs, as well as help people who are unhoused get to a place of stability. They are given the opportunity to other housing options, which don't need the services anymore.
So the property opened last October, I guess 6 months into it opening. Are there any case stories so far of people that have lived there, then moved into an apartment, or too early to tell?
It's too early to tell. And actually what we did see was we saw a lot of the refugees coming in from other countries all over the border that were getting shipped over to New York and getting sent to New York. And frankly, those refugees, they're desperate for work. They're desperate to find community. And so we've seen that they don't need to stay as long as 12 months. So some people have moved out and found either family or friends or found jobs. West Hab is working with the city and saying, this is what we have available. These are the services that we're providing, in particular at our apartment complex. And these are the services that the city is aware of in other places. And so the city is really placing people directly based on their lists of people that they get. And like I said, New York State is a right to shelter state. So they have lists of people who want housing or need housing.
Yeah, so this is really kind of like a launch pad for people into more of a stable housing situation. Really, it's meant to be like almost an incubator, giving people that full wraparound services and starting up on kind of a new path. But you're putting a lot of investment into this incubator that's going to create more stable residents long term.
We're trying to find ways to make people who have unfortunately been left behind by the community to become active members of the community again. Yes, we believe housing first, but we also believe that it's housing with services. It's not just housing that people are needed. It's not just affordable housing that people are needing. It's some level of care for their children, some level of security and comfort that they're going to be not in danger at any point, and some level of services so that they can, if they've been left behind by the community, that they can get back into the community and be given a lifeline, that, a second opportunity, a third opportunity, whatever it might take. And the city is able to accomplish their goal to lift up the people who are unhoused, decreasing the burden on the police, the firemen, hospital services.
So while 109 new units of transitional housing is great, looking at the context of the problem of homelessness in New York City, per some statistics from the Coalition for the Homeless, New York City homelessness has reached record levels, highest levels since 1930s and the Great Depression. There are almost 70,000 people experiencing homelessness. 22,000 of those are children. There's a lot more work to be done. Just curious if you have more sites in the pipeline and how you're kind of looking at future projects.
Housing in New York City is the most expensive part of living in New York City. And we continue to see housing costs increase in New York City. And Standard Communities is actively talking to the Department of Homeless Services and the mayor's office all the time to find ways to replicate what we did here at West 41st Street. And so we're looking at vacant properties, we're looking at vacant lots where we could build from the ground up. New York has done a great job in this situation and in many other situations. There's a constant need by the community to lift up the people who have been left behind.
Great. Well, Scott, thank you so much for providing an overview of this innovative transitional housing project.
Well, thanks, Charlie, for the time as well. And I love what you're doing with the Housing Innovation Collaborative.